This is Daniel Officer, assignment 2 for psychology amendments. Are you laid back, too hyped, or at your peak? It's Tuesday, the 11th of March at 20 to 3. So, firstly, is the Holds drive theory. An example of the Holds drive theory would be weightlifting, as the more and more aroused you become, the more weight you would lift, therefore demonstrating the Holds drive theory is you would never reach a peak, you would only improve and get better each time you were to lift. The more aroused you become, the better your performance. So therefore, in weightlifting, the more weight that you will be able to lift. Inverted U hypothesis skill. An example of this would be in basketball. When completing a layup, arousal will be very low, as the task is very basic and very easy. Whereas when you're taking a 3-point shot, this is a much more difficult skill. Therefore, your arousal would be much higher. And that's if you're an elite athlete. Therefore, the layup would be very easy and you score every time, whereas a 3-point shot would be much different, therefore affecting arousal. Level of performer. The higher the level of performer, the higher level of arousal will be, therefore the better task will be carried out by an individual. The higher arousal situation is when the dominant behaviour is carried out, therefore the more successful the elite athlete will be, whereas the less successful the novice and intermediate will be. Because intermediate will therefore not be as good as the elite athlete, therefore meaning that the dominant behaviour in a situation would be to miss. So, for example, if there was a penalty in a high pressure situation, such as the 90th minute of a World Cup, then the dominant behaviour of the elite athlete would be to score, as they would have much experience in this situation. Whereas the dominant behaviour of the intermediate athlete and the novice athlete would be to miss, obviously, because they're not trained and as skilled in this certain situation. Catastrophe theory. This is basically where, so at points A, B, and C, so these 3 points here, this is when the athlete is choked and completely crashes in a certain situation. So therefore it causes a massive decrease in arousal, which is a sudden decrease, which would be a point A to B, which therefore where they cannot even perform basic tasks. And then whereas A, B, D, so this situation here, is when the athlete is to decrease. So obviously A to B again will be the sudden decrease, but then begins to recover and increase arousal levels, therefore increasing performance. So for example, in basketball, when you start to reach your peak from scoring every shot, then you are given a 3-throw and miss, which causes a sudden decrease in performance, meaning you are unable to perform basic skills such as passing. So that situation there is where you begin to choke. It's known as choking when you cannot perform even the basic tasks in your sport, and therefore you'd have to rebuild, or perhaps not rebuild and end up finishing the game very, very low in arousal and very weak, given a poor performance. Sympathetic and parasympathetic response. The sympathetic response occurs when you're at points of stress. It means when something is to increase. So in a certain situation of high amounts of stress, things like your pupils may begin to dilate. Your heart rate will increase as you're stressing. You're starting to panic more. Your heart's starting to pump more blood around the body. Your breathing rate increases due to stress. Obviously, that would increase as you're under a high pressure situation, perhaps, or a situation you're not quite familiar with. That's just a few examples. And then the parasympathetic response is when things decrease. So this situation occurs when you're relaxed. So this is when your pupils are constrict and your heart rate will decrease back to a normal, if not just under normal, as you're in a relaxed state, you're very comfortable. Your heart rate will decrease, and your breathing rate will decrease. It would also be another example of a parasympathetic response. The sympathetic response, they work at the same time, but it works a lot harder than the parasympathetic, because when you're stressed, obviously, the body's working much harder due to the increased blood and increased heart rate. Therefore, your body's working 10 times harder than it is in a state of stress than it is when the body's relaxed. They both work together at times of stress and distress in order to control arousal. The sympathetic response occurs due to stress levels. As the more stressed you are, the more these effects occur. For example, the slower your metabolism will be, whereas the parasympathetic occurs when you are distressed, meaning that they will be much better and work normally. For example, increase in saliva in the body. Anxiety. A referred quote of anxiety would be a state of uneasiness and apprehension as about future uncertainties. There are 3 different types: state anxiety, trait anxiety, and somatic anxiety. An example of state anxiety would be if you were to start panicking before a boxing match, causing you to lose focus and technique due to your opponent being much bigger and having a lot more wins than you. Um, an example of trait anxiety, this would be sweating before a match against about a middle table team, so someone who's just on an average standard but still making you worry a little bit. And then somatic anxiety is this example of this would be is muscle fatigue, as your muscles tighten due to fatigue, and an athlete may take this as they have pulled a muscle, causing this to affect their performance. Behavioural response. This is split up into three different sections. This is cognitive, somatic, and behavioural. Our behavioural responses is our pattern of behaviour when we experience situations of stress. Um, Cognitive, this is what occurs inside your head. This is your thought process when experiencing stress. So, for example, like indecision, feeling heavy, or having poor concentration. A sporting example of this would be taking a penalty in football and being indecisive upon where you're going to hit the ball, which causes you to miss because you can't pick where you're going to place the ball. Another example would be if someone was to pass you the ball in football and you were to miscontrol it, letting the ball run out of play due to poor concentration. Somatic. This is your body's reaction to stress. So, for example, like increased heart rate, dry mouth, twitching and fidgeting. A sporting example of somatic would be taking a free throw in basketball and getting sweaty palms, causing you to lose grip of the ball and have an inaccurate shot. Another example of this would be in curling when playing to win the match. You get a very dry mouth, making you unable to shout clearly what you want the sweepers to do in order to move the stone into a certain situation. And then finally, behavioural. This is what you do with your body at times of high stress, such as biting your fingernails, fidgeting, and having a very closed posture. A sporting example of this would be when taking a penalty flick in hockey and messing about with the grip on your stick before you're taking it. Um, Another example of this would be when taking a conversion in rugby, you're playing with your hands, biting your fingernails before you're about to take the kick. Thank you.